My name is John Landgrave. I am with a team at Microsoft called the Global Black Belts, which is effectively a team that focuses on a particular set of products. In our case, that's the Power Platform. And our job is really to be kind of a conduit between our customers and field and our product group. And so we're asked to be a 300, 400 level expert on certain areas of the platform. My particular areas include governance and security, as well as enterprise integration with ERP systems, so Oracle, SAP, PeopleSoft, those kind of things. We of course have to go through the obligatory marketing slides. So just a couple of quick things. Again, what we're attempting to do here is to take the Power Platform and make it the engine for digital transformation, and kind of the fuel in that engine is really our data connector infrastructure. So this connector infrastructure is what allows us to expose data from these different platforms to everyone with a skill set from the low code drag and drop developer all the way up through the pro developer. I will preface this discussion and tell you that the marketing isn't always 100% accurate from that standpoint, and so which will become obvious as we go through here. But it's important to point out, if you've used other connectors in the Power Platform, that unlike many of the other connectors, the SAP connectors are really only accessible via Flow and Logic apps, meaning that there's no experience to drag a connector on a PowerApps screen and just start interrogating SAP like you can with a SQL table, right? So it's not designed to be a visual connector per se. It is designed to allow you to go build your own API infrastructure. And we'll talk as we kind of get into more detail into how the implementation has been done. We'll also talk about some implementation details on how you take the assets that we have provided as part of this release and how you would use those when you go to implement this in your organizations. So when you go in to go build your applications just at a high level, as I mentioned, this won't be going into the maker experience in PowerApps. You'll actually go into the maker experience for Power Automate. And if you go through and search for SAP connectors, then this is what you're going to see that comes back. So a couple things just to be crystal clear. There are two call SAP functions, and the original connector is still available and accessible for legacy reasons. However, the configuration of that connector is markedly different from the configuration and functionality of the V2 connector. So when you're going in to build your applications, it's important that you, if you're integrating with an SAP API, what they call a BAPI or business API or an RFC, you're going to make that call using this call SAP function V2 connector. And again, when we go through the demo, I'll show this in more detail, but I wanted to bring this up front because I do get this question a lot. In fact, the last 2 or 3 times I've been on troubleshooting calls, the issue was they didn't pick the V2 connector, so they couldn't get everything configured. So it's critical that you use the call SAP function V2 connector whenever you are making an API call. If you are doing a read table, so we found a very common function, whether it's because you're offloading data that you want to process separately, or whether it's doing lookups, index lookups into tables. So say taking a vendor number and looking up a vendor name, that functionality is encapsulated inside of SAP in what's called a read table. So it's a fast indexed read with a limited number of keys to bring back a value or a specific set of values. And so those of you doing SAP are familiar with read table. And we'll look at that in more detail later. But we actually broke that out into a separate function because in the original connector, even though it was possible to do, it required a lot of machinations to do the proper parsing when the data came back. So we've just broken that out separately so we can manage the parsing as a separate part of that connector. And then the third thing that we've broken out for simplicity is anytime that you're doing an update to SAP, whether that's a create or an update of an existing record, SAP requires you to have the session state for the session you used to read the data in order to update the data to make sure that those two things match. And so when you're doing creates or updates, you need to call this stateful session method first to create the session before you go through and do the rest of your work. So these are just some of the details of the connectors. Want to make sure that we're clear about what those things are. And again, we have examples that I'll show you kind of later on about how this all fits together. So that's a very brief detour into just what the specific connectors are that are there and how they're accessed. That is via Power Automate. But the question that we get a lot from customers in these kinds of discussions is, so if I have this power, what should I do with it, right? I mean, what are the types of things that customers are doing? So I just kind of pulled together at a high level some of the things that I'm working on with customers to implement using this technology in the Power Platform. And I won't drill into these in great detail, but my hope is that anyone who's participating in this call might see themselves or their organizations in the context of one of these examples of how customers are consuming it. So the first one is both widely used and also widely misused, and we'll talk about what those kind of two ends of the spectrum are. But the widely used part of the spectrum is that SAP is a very complex system, and even for some simple tasks, it may require you to take the same data and put it on multiple screens, or to take data from one screen and move it to another screen. And because of the level of granularity of many of these screens, there are cases where it may take you 8 to 10 screens to do something, when in fact the data that you're collecting or massaging can actually fit on a single screen. It's just because those screens are reused in multiple places, architecturally it made more sense to make them separate and then accessible from different places. So the SAP methodology of creating reusable things and in standardizing on APIs is a really good thing from the perspective that the code that ran against APIs 20 years ago still runs today, and many of the screens that were created 20 years ago are still in use today with the same formats, with some minor cosmetic changes, but functionally are the same screen. So the good news is once you have trained people on how to use their set of SAP functions and screens, then they can be fairly productive, even if they happen to see the same screen pop up in some other workflow. The problem is, of course, that it's not that simple, because departments turn over, people move, systems change, workflows change. That is, business workflows change. And so what we've had customers look at in terms of what this technology allows is for them to take a business function in a business function in SAP that may require calling multiple business APIs, but instead of going through multiple screens in SAP, having a single screen that is a Power App, or a tab screen in a Power App, or some other visual representation in the Power App that accomplishes the same function, but the user of the application needs no training or expertise in SAP specifically, because the application has been written to match their workflow and to match their terminology, and it simply consumes SAP on the back end. And because we always consume SAP in these scenarios through the BAPIs, we're not going at tables directly or modifying anything. We're always consuming these in the context of the SAP process, which gives our SAP brethren on that side much more comfort that we're not creating a scenario where they would have inconsistent data or process. And I'll show you an example of that. In fact, we're going to provide a bunch of examples of those kinds of functions to help you kind of see how you would use those things. The other thing that's important to understand is there are tasks that you may accomplish in SAP. So approving a PO or any kind of approval task, or even asking questions about how much money's in this account, or how many days of vacation do I have, or what those things are, that could also be accomplished without a screen at all. And again, the beauty of the Power Platform is that when I have things like AI Builder and chatbots, where I can go out and create an interface, a brand new interface into SAP that someone can consume from inside of Teams or from a web page or any other place where I could surface that bot or consume that AI model. It gives you a lot more opportunities to eliminate the need for a UI for functionality that is simple and can be managed through some other automated mechanism. So that's one of the primary use cases, and frankly, probably 50 to 60% of the customers that is their primary use case, is trying to get away from learning SAP and instead learning process and then representing that process in the form of a set of Power Apps that are task or purpose specific. So the second area that's pretty broad that we're seeing a lot of adoption in is around building applications, reports, systems that consume SAP data, but those consumption exercises are ancillary to the purpose of whatever the function is. So they need the SAP data, but they're actually using that in concert with some expense system at someplace else, or some other operational system that's written in, using SQL Server or something else. So again, the idea here is that I need the ability to go in and create my own reports or applications. I need to consume the SAP data, but it's not the primary purpose of the application. The SAP data in many cases is reference data. In some cases is the end of a long process that results in a transaction, but is not the linchpin or the purpose of the overall application. A third major area is building applications that are outside of the browser or outside of the Windows machine. And in fact, with the deprecation of SAP's NetWeaver mobile technology, we actually have a lot of customers who are evaluating, and some who have decided that they are going to use our offline Power Platform capabilities to replace their NetWeaver SAP implementations while they're SAP NetWeaver mobile SAP implementations. And so rather than using the NetWeaver stack with Java, they will use our stack with PowerFX as their language, and then using our offline capabilities, either Dataverse offline or the load data, save data functionality available within the native Maker experience. And so this comes in. So in the case of doing having a mobile device that's running either on or offline, being able to have things like warehouse scanners that can run online or offline, call center integration. So if you have an existing call center system that doesn't have native SAP integration, being able to do screen pops and those kinds of things by using the flows that you've built to integrate with other systems at a raw API level. Can give you some fairly immediate productivity returns by not having to replicate data, but being able to access data in place and in the context of the user who's consuming it. The other interesting scenario we've seen a couple of times are people writing basically web scraping applications where they're taking scraping an Amazon screen where a user goes in and puts an order together and then uses an on-screen indicator to say this is my order, and they actually take the data out of the web page and push the orders directly into the system using Amazon business accounts. Again, that's just one kind of example of how they're doing that. But the takeaway there is combining RPA or some other screen scraping technology and then taking that and feeding it into SAP. But rather than driving SAP with RPA, which is very efficient and brittle, they're using RPA to drive the website, but using DPA and our connectors to go in and actually do the back end processing. And I mentioned offline application, then of course the issue with being able to do workflow. We've actually had several customers who built SAP workflow approval systems in SAP, in ABAP, using SAP resources, which was, if you're an SAP developer and ABAP is your hammer, then everything's a nail. And so obviously there are reasons you would do that. But what they're finding is being able to integrate those approvals with things like Teams and using adaptive cards and building interfaces for approvals that span not just SAP functionality, but other system functionalities and approving across those multiple work surfaces has been one of those things that folks have looked at and found to be very productive. I did mention an anti-pattern, and I should have a background on how that went, but basically what I want to make sure, here's the message I want to make sure that you're not getting, which is we are not recommending that you do a one-for-one replacement of an SAP screen with a Power App, okay, or an SAP screen with a Power App screen. Frankly, SAP has good tools for modifying their screens and their flow, right? I mean, using Fiori or using SAP GUI or something like that to extend and inside of the SAP domain, because you have SAP developers who are already proficient in those tools, is frankly a more efficient use of their time. If you're doing screen for screen replacement, which is just not very efficient, but it's screens, it's process replacement using a Power App where you get the bang for the buck, not the screen for screen. I'm just going to rewrite SAP and Power Apps. And I know that may seem odd to some of you, but I've actually had a couple of customers tell me that's what they intended to do. And then when we walked through that, they figured out that probably wasn't a very good idea. So once we've had customers who have identified that there is a business case, there is a use case, they want to do a proof of concept, they want to kind of figure out how to make all this work, the next question is, so how do we organize our activities to be the most productive as we're going through this exercise to first do a POC or MVP and then ultimately move into a production scenario? And so as we work with these customers, we've found a couple things. The first is that it's important to identify the personas involved in any of these things and what are the responsibilities for those personas. And so it's rare that one person can be in all three of these roles. There are cases that it happens, but in most cases it does not. And so, when you go into an organization that's made a heavy investment in SAP, they absolutely have people who are SAP developers or BAPI developers, right? They're writing ABAP code on the back end. They write function modules. They do all of the work on the SAP back end, and they have been doing that work and supporting that infrastructure in many cases for 15 or 20 years. So there's this wealth of information about the way that SAP works and which BAPIs can be used to affect which business processes, right? So it isn't just about their technical acumen on the SAP platform. It is that they, in many cases, are the best people to understand what specific set and order of implementation would be required to most closely mimic and maintain the SAP process flow, and not be in a position where you're doing something that is antithetical to what you're trying to accomplish on the back end. And then that third persona is also fairly common. So finding folks today in an organization that are well-versed in Power Platform applications and writing Power Apps and flows and Power BI and virtual agents, the whole kind of stack is becoming increasingly common to find. The issue becomes that there has to be a Rosetta Stone between those two. There has to be some way for the BAPI developer to have a conversation with the Power Apps or the Flow developer to say, well, how do these things map together? And how do I make sure that the communication is being done securely, that the data being returned is being trimmed properly based on the authorizations that are accessible to that particular user account, et cetera. And so this role that we've seen emerging in customers, and many times it is a specifically identified role into which either a BAPI developer app dev tends to flow. Mostly, frankly, it comes from the app dev side, but it really doesn't matter. But the recognition that there needs to be someone whose focus is on understanding the intricacy of how individual APIs get called and then how that data gets then mapped into structures that can be consumed not just within Power Automate, but can then be surfaced within Power Apps or a chatbot or an AI builder call, for example. So there is this integration piece of understanding and translating between the data coming back from SAP, the presentation of that API, and how that works together. So again, you're typically going to see people who consume one or all of these personas on any kind of team that begins to go build things out. And frankly, not having that middle role. In fact, I've seen customers who tried not to use that middle persona, and they spent the first 4 weeks talking past each other. So we also, just FYI, do have a workshop that we've developed designed to target that integration developer. So what is it that person needs to know in order to go through, they enough to be dangerous on the BAPI side and enough to be helpful on the flow side, the Power Automate side, to be able to expose the data in a consistent way for users. And we have plenty of examples of the artifact that integration developer would customize or provide. And again, we'll look at those things in a second. But the goal here is that this team of folks will take the entire set of connectors, not just the SAP connector, and work toward what Gartner calls the enterprise agility layer. And so not everyone uses the Gartner term, obviously, and there are going to be, I don't see a lot of cases where it truly is enterprise-wide. Frankly, in most organizations, they have a specific initiative that they want to drive, and they build an agility layer that supports that initiative from any surface, right? So building out the agility layer in a way that it can be consumed from Power Apps, it can be consumed from other Power Automate flows, it can be consumed from chatbots, and frankly could be consumed from other non-Microsoft platforms, where this agility layer effectively becomes a microservices layer that exposes SAP in a secure and manageable way. So what we've provided basically is a set of APIs implemented in Flow. And the concept here is that we'll take the complexity of SAP and mask that with the simplicity of Flow, to the extent that you believe Flow is simple. But it's certainly simpler than the complexity of the SAP API. And so the end result there is a set of APIs implemented in Flow that you can take and parse out and repackage and rebuild any way you want to represent your enterprise agility API layer, or simply custom API layers for different functions. And so it is our vision that as you create solutions from these flows, you would create solutions that represent some specific business actor process, that you would take some of the flows that we provide, some flows that you develop, connectors to other things that are part of that process. You will build then a solution that is the API layer, but no UI, deploy that into a dev environment and build on top of that. And so you're going to be maintaining an API layer that's primarily going to be your BAPI and integration folks, and then a UI layer in a separate solution that is primarily maintained by your application developers and your integration developer, to the extent that they need to tweak the return values or formats to make them more consumable. So once you understand kind of what does it look like, who are the players, what's the goal, it's important to point out what the capabilities and limitations are of this connector, and to contrast that with what is the complete realm of capability that is available from the Power Platform. So this connector, represented by that top box, or this set of connectors, is very specifically designed to make direct API or RFC calls. We can use the iDoc interface. We can do RFC read tables. We can call functions that custom ABAP functions that have been marked as externally accessible, and process the return data from those. So effectively, for 99% of the functionality in SAP that is exposed through one of those interfaces, you can use this connector to get to that, and you can get to that whether it's ECC or HANA. The way that we accomplish this is through the use of the data gateway. So I want to be crystal clear. Today, there is no direct connectivity from a Power Platform connector to an SAP instance. It has to go through the data gateway. The reason it has to go through the data gateway is that the data gateway has the SAP NetWeaver integration code running on the gateway, and it is translating a request coming from Power Automate into the appropriate request, BAPI request, and syntax and protocol necessary to then call into SAP. And so that translation layer today has to be there, and it has to be installed on the data gateway. Now, over time, our plan is to take the data gateway code and to move that into our connector infrastructure. And the reason we're doing that is that then you can make a direct private connection. You will be able, you can't now, you will be able to make a direct but private connection from our cloud directly into your SAP instance and not have to go through this gateway. So again, that's a roadmap item. We don't have a timeline on that, so I'm not committing when or how that will be implemented. I'm simply telling you that we recognize over the long term having to manage a separate set of machines, whether they're virtual or not, that do this translation it's a hop we'd rather not have our customers be forced to consume. The other thing to be aware of, and of course, as SAP users or architects, you know that there are multiple authentication mechanisms for SAP. So I can use SAP credentials, just user ID password, kind of in a basic auth kind of scenario. I can use Windows authentication, and I can use integrated Active Directory authentication. Okay, and again, we're not talking about authorization. Authorization is always done by SAP, but by the credentials that are passed through. We don't have our own authorization. That's all SAP based. But for authentication, it's going to be one of those three credential sets. The other thing that may not be obvious from this, but I want to make sure I call it out because it's an implementation detail you will certainly run into when you go to implement the gateway, is that if you are using either Windows or AD authentication, then what's going to happen there is that your browser or your Power Platform client is going to get your credential from whichever of those stores, whether you log in with your Windows auth or whether we just pass through the OAuth credential with the currently logged in user in an SSO scenario. But that token isn't going directly to SAP. It's going to the gateway first. And because it's going to the gateway first, we have to have a way to impersonate that user when we pass that token through to SAP. And we accomplish that by using Kerberos. So if you are using SSO or you're using even if you're just using Windows auth but not using SSO, if you're using a token-based authentication mechanism instead of a ID password-based SAP mechanism, then you will have to also configure Kerberos between the SAP system and the data gateway, and the data gateway needs to be configured in a way that it's authorized to issue impersonation tokens on behalf of the SAP server. So there is another piece of complexity there that you should be aware of. In many organizations, Kerberos is already implemented. Like if you're using Macs for clients or iPads or anything that's a non-Windows box, in many cases you already have to have Kerberos in place to support that. So that may or may not be an additional configuration issue. But just be aware that hop between those two, if it's a token-based scheme, will require Kerberos with impersonation configured. So this gets me to S2, ECC, or HANA. What about the other SAP properties? So it's important to understand that other than ECC and HANA, the other properties like SuccessFactors, Concur, CAM, all those things were acquisitions And those acquisitions have been made to function and interoperate with ECC and HANA, but in many cases have vastly different implementations of API calls and those kind of things. And so for that reason, because that BAPI RFC infrastructure was not replicated to those acquisitions, and they have their own methodology or authentication, our ability to access them means we have to use a different methodology, right? A more kind of just industry standard protocols to do that. So we do give you the ability to use the OData connector over HTTP and an SAP infrastructure architect has to go into SAP and configure the OData endpoints and the security on those endpoints and the type and shape of data that gets returned from those endpoints. So by default, you can't just fire up Power Platform and start hitting an SAP server or hitting a SuccessFactors server. Those ODBC endpoints, OData endpoints have to be configured on the back end before they are accessible. They're also permissioned at the back end. So there's a lot of configuration that the SAP engineering team has to do to make that work. Whereas if the ECC and HANA calls, as long as the authentication token will pass, there's no additional configuration that has to be done because it's all done with a known ID with a known API interface. You also have the option of building a custom connector and having that custom connector access a REST API on one of those backends. Again, the SAP engineering team has to go and configure those REST API endpoints. They have to permission them and put throttling and any other functionality required to make those accessible before those could be consumed from the Power Platform. But it is, in fact, we do have customers who are writing applications where, say, they're integrating teams with the SuccessFactors, for example. They want to take training that's being done and move those things back and forth. And so your ability to consume these non-BAPI-based systems is not compromised by using the Power Platform. You simply have to use either an OData connector or custom connector to do that. And once that's there, again, if that's as long as that's built out as part of your agility layer to the consumer, that is the low-code developer who's consuming them, they don't perceive there to be any difference in the way that works versus the BAPI approach. It's the same authentication, and the authorization takes place in the back end, and the data gets returned in a format that they can consume in the client. So that's transparent if the agility layer is developed properly. We do have the ability as well to do RPA against the SAP GUI. I will tell you that is, frankly, the least desirable method. It's great for prototyping, but generally the folks who use the RPA methodology use that because they don't know enough about how DPA works. They don't understand the BAPIs. They're generally not working with their SAP engineering team to do that. They're doing that to try to avoid having to work with their engineering team. And frankly, RPA, although it can be very powerful, is also pretty brittle because even the slightest changes in screen design or order or those kind of things could render an RPA function unusable. So, we have RPA, we have customers using RPA. There are certainly cases in a truly low-code only environment where you have citizen devs trying to stitch together Power Platform applications that include SAP access, but they don't know anybody who knows SAP. It's an easy entry-level point for them to go in and consume SAP using RPA. But once you start getting into how do I build something that's sustainable and scalable and easy to monitor, we have seen people kind of move away from RPA and move more towards DPA. Frankly, before we released these versions of the controls, that was a much better option because the prior version of the SAP connector before October of 2021 was pretty limited and not as performant as customers are used to from Microsoft. So let me stop there real quick. I've talked for a while. I haven't heard any heads hit the desk yet, but that might be because people are muted. But I do want to just take a real quick stop and see if there are any specific questions about what we've covered so far before we kind of go look in more detail at how this is implemented. So let's go through and look under the covers at how this is actually implemented. There are two pieces of technology that you need to go in and successfully build out your POC or MVP on SAP EIEIO. Just wanted to make sure we got enough letters in there. The first piece, of course, is the connector itself. And so those connectors are already installed in your tenant and available unless they have been blocked by DLP. So you do need to make sure that the connector's not been blocked in an environment so that's accessible to you. And then even when you have the connectors available to you, you will need to be able to go in and create a connection using the connector. And so I'm not going to go through that only because the connection process is really not different than creating any other connection you would make, whether it's a SQL. And that's part of the beauty of the platform. If I know how to make a create a connection to SQL, then I know how to create a connection to SAP. The second piece that you need and that we currently provide through a GitHub site. Unfortunately, that GitHub site has not been updated recently. So if you need this in the interim, let me know and we'll make it available to you. But this is a solution that includes all of the artifacts required to consume an SAP instance. And so what you're seeing here is I have set up a dedicated environment called general availability. And inside that environment, I have installed this SAP Integration Solution. Okay. And this SAP Integration Solution is what contains all of the artifacts that we're producing. Basically, these are demonstration artifacts that you can use to either build your own flows or build your own apps to consume the flows as is. Okay. What we're seeing in the work that I'm doing with most of our early adopters is that they load this solution up. They go look through the flows to kind of see how they're put together. They'll run the sample applications and then look at the code in the sample applications to see how the actual flows are consumed. And then they may write their first couple of apps or samples or even their initial POC against the flows that we deliver. But then when they actually go to start doing production implementations, they will take out the flows from this solution and any other artifacts out of this solution, put them into a separate solution, again, all unmanaged, and then they will build all those interfaces in that solution, but no visual interface. They don't put their PowerApps or anything in that solution. They just put the flows in that solution. They'll take that, make it a managed solution, put it into a development environment, where then in that development environment, people will create their own unmanaged solutions that can consume those flows. And that way they know that the API implementation is consistent, irrespective of what the UI consumption of the API is. And it's then becomes easier as they go through a dev test prod cycle to make sure that the API surface itself is consistent across those environments, and all they're really promoting and testing are the UI elements. So what's in this solution? This solution contains today over 100 artifacts. This is the first GA release of the solution. We do have some changes that we're making, really mostly additions. Like we have a couple of examples of making IDOC calls. So for example, there's not a BAPI to create a GL account, but we have customers who want to be able to go in and at a month-end closing or at some reorganization, they want to be able to have a flow or an application that lets them go kind of redesign their chart of accounts or add additional cost centers, and they want to dynamically or programmatically create those GL accounts and cost centers and those kind of things. And so you have to be able to use the iDoc interface to do that. And so we're adding some flows that demonstrate how to use things that don't have a BAPI specifically, but can be done through the iDoc interface. So my point is that there will be some additional things coming out, some in April, and then some additional ones in June, and we'll talk about in a minute about what those are. But what you see here is we have about 58 flows and about 30 apps, which are the most significant things. These apps, which I'll show you in a second, are the kind of purpose-built life cycle applications, procure to pay, order to cash, those kinds of things that we are producing to give people kind of end-to-end examples of how you can wrap a set of SAP functionality and to do that as part of your solution. What I want to do real quickly is kind of just walk into one of the flows. So if I go here and just filter this on flows, you'll see that I basically have a set of create flows, a set of read flows, and a set of update flows. We do have functions to do things like delete line items, delete POs, those kind of things that happen through the update mechanism. I mean, the way SAP is architected is nothing is ever actually deleted, it's flagged and those kind of things, which is insignificant from a development perspective, other than the fact that the way you call it needs to be consistent with the way SAP processes it. But again, examples of all those things are in the apps themselves. I see one question here about the difference between SAP ECC and HANA. I will tell you that one of the key use cases, which I didn't specifically mention, but now I see the question I should add, is we have customers who recognize that the UI differences between ECC and HANA with the SAP GUI in many cases are significant, but the API differences are not. In other words, it's the same BAPI in ECC and in HANA. So we have customers writing Power Platform applications for task-based functions against ECC. And then as they migrate different things to HANA, they're basically just going into the app and change into the flow, the API layer, and changing it to point to HANA instead of pointing to ECC, and the app doesn't change. So again, that one of the most effective ways, especially because this migration can take more than a week, let's say, but let's just say it can take a while to do the migration. So being able to go through and build that now and have people begin consuming it, and then have them continue to use the exact same application, even as the back end changes, is really kind of a game changer for them. So the other question, real quick, before I get into the detail, there's a question here about exporting data. So yes, and John's answered that. So yes, we can. I want to be clear here. For HANA, I have BW because BW is the query engine that lets me grab data out of HANA. Okay, ECC doesn't have the equivalent query engine. Okay. So you can extract data from ECC and you can use that data in a data lake or other things. But to do that, you effectively need to do all read tables, bring the data back fast, right? Pull that into a data lake, for example, and then build your Snowflake or your cubes and things from there. Okay. We are doing some work to make the acquisition of ECC data more efficient. Using both data flows and flow, and you will likely see some announcements in the May-June timeframe around that. So we do recognize the need to make ECC data more easily accessible to Power BI, and we understand that need. We're working on that, but to be clear, the issue here is the lack of a query processing function, which BW provides for HANA, but there is no equivalent for ECC. So we're working on making that easier. Okay. So So let's take an example of one of these flows, just so you get some flavor for what's happening, because it's important to understand that this isn't like making a database call where I'm saying, query this table and give me back this list of things, right? This is more of a call that a single call is designed to bring back a data set of related data that can then be processed in the Power Platform and then returned in that same structure in a way that SAP can consume it. So, for example, what you'll see in this flow is we have a PowerApps trigger, and that PowerApps trigger, basically what you're doing is passing in an order number, a purchase order, right? And so you see here that this is the ASCII PowerApps symbol, where it's when this is called, the IntelliSense in the flow will actually say, I need you to send me the order value, right? So you're going to see what are the values that are expected to be returned, okay? And so you get the order in, the flow then collects. We're basically just creating some variables to hold things, right? And then we're actually making a call, and this is where the magic happens, right? So in this case, what we're doing is we're making a call to SAP using a predefined set of connection parameters, which we'll look at in a second. We call a specific RFC, which in this case is BAPI PO get detail, and we pass in the order number that came from the initial call from PowerApps. Now, some of these other fields are an indication of not just the complexity of SAP, but the need to understand the complexity of SAP, right? So you need to know, and here's the thing, where an SAP developer will know that when I call the get detail BAPI, that if I want to know, get account assignment information, or if I want to get all the header text, and if I want the item text and not just the item entries, part number and quantity, that I have to specify that I need that additional data to be pulled back by putting an X in these fields. Right. So this is where the knowledge of how SAP works and the need to be able to work with SAP developers comes in, because again, we're providing this for you. So if you're calling one of the flows that we're providing that maps to a BAPI, we've already done the work for you to see what's happening. But if there are BAPIs we haven't exposed, or if it's a function module that has different requirements, then you'll have to work with the SAP developer as the integration developer to go through and figure out, when you make this call, what other parameters have to be passed, right? And what you'll see here is that there are a lot of different parameters that can be passed on any given call. In this particular case, there are upwards of 300 different things that you can pass in when you make a call to BAPI get detail. Now, a couple things. We will be releasing an update later this year where, instead of listing all of these things out, we'll simply have an input section and an output section, and you can pick the thing you want to set a value for and set the value, because obviously this gets a little bit cumbersome, having to scroll up and down through this to see values that you in fact may never consume. So again, we're doing some work to clean up this API call as well. But I'm going to go back real quick and just close this. So I make that call, and then I get back a set of data, right? And so now what I'm checking to see is, did I get any outputs in the PO detail, right? So did I get information back? If I got information back, then I can go through and begin breaking out the PO history, right? I can break out the extended header data. I can check to see what approvals have already been done and bring those back, okay? So here's a case. I'm doing a read table against the table we all know and love, CD POS, which happens to be the approvals table. And I'm going to bring back that approval data. And if I get the data that the approval happened, then I also have to go back and I have to go make another call and find out who the approver was by doing another read table that looks at the employee ID, grabs back the employee data, and brings it back, right? And then once I've done that, I'm going to parse the items, the history. I'm going to take the goods receipts, any parked invoices. I'm going to check for existing payments on the invoice, along with any header text. And then I'm going to take the vendor number and look up the vendor name again using a read table to go look the vendor name up. And then what I'm going to return, I'm going to take the header data, parse it out into a format that is more easily consumed by PowerApps. Because again, this data might be coming back in something like fixed zero lengths, fixed zero padded strings, for example, or it might be coming back as a set of data with pipes that are delineating a data set that have to be parsed out into individual elements. So rather than relying on the Power App user maker who may or may not know how to do those functions, we're doing all of the work inside of the actual flow to return that as a set of JSON, right? So what you're getting back is a couple of JSON objects with order data and header data, and then a set of JSON arrays, which are items, invoices, parked invoices, receipts, and payments. And because we're returning this structure back to you, you can manipulate that structure and push it back to SAP. And as long as you don't change the structure of the JSON objects we send to you, then you can do that turnaround and push that back. And it's already formatted in a way that we know how to take that, parse it back out, and push it back to SAP. So if I were to show you the update purchase order flow, what you would see would be this structure broken back out and then pushed back through BAPIs to do the update, right? So we've taken care of the round trip of the data structure for any particular for the most of the top level elements: purchase orders, sales orders, customers, etc. And then all you have to do is be able to manipulate that structure inside of your application, whether it's inside of the flow or a chatbot or whatever, and then you can consume or update that in any way you choose. So the other thing we provided are a set of applications. And so many of these applications are root level applications, and some of them, like lookups, these search lookups, are search forms that get reused across all the applications. So there's one consistent search experience, whether you're looking for anywhere you're looking for a PO. For example, you'd have a consistent experience. So just real quickly, here is an example of the applications that we are providing out of the box. So, we have order to cash and sales. I can go through customers and quotes and orders, deliveries, etc. We then have procure to pay in purchasing, which includes vendor management, requisition management, managing purchase orders, and then again, the same tools for things like financial management. So if I want to do my own custom and closing or updating, and then doing things like materials management, dispatch, notifications, those kind of things are all built into the production application set. So you basically have a set of applications inside of a container that you can go out and call. And so as you can see, and I'm not going to go through this, I'm not going to go through the whole process, but what you're seeing here is my purchase order application where I can go in and create a new purchase order. I can change a purchase order. Again, as I mentioned before, the authorization for functions comes from SAP. Not from PowerApps. So in this example, I'm an administrator, so I can see the approve button. But what you'll see in these applications is that we query the metadata on the SAP side to see whether the user of the application has particular abilities. And based on what their permissions are, we can show and hide elements of the screen. So if they don't have the ability to create a purchase order or to approve one, but only to change an existing one, then that's the only option that they would see, right? So we do have code that demonstrates how you would go through and consume the flows and how to make sure that the authorization is done in a meaningful way. So that's really kind of a quick walkthrough of what the implementation is. And again, happy to have more discussions about the implementation details and how these artifacts can be reused. So as I mentioned before, we did have a prior SAP connector. That prior SAP connector used system accounts and had some pretty severe limitations on its ability to use SAP assets. So things like using the SAP load balancing capabilities. SSO was not fully implemented. So even though that connector existed, its best use was really for read-only access to referential data from an application. It really wasn't robust enough to develop a full-blown CRUD system against SAP. So in October of 21, we acquired a company. The president of that company is now the leader of our enterprise integration team inside of Microsoft. So in addition to the SAP work that's being done, we'll be working on adding the same kinds of functionality to Oracle and to our Dynamics F&O product. So again, our goal is that our API service will be consistent across different ERP systems. So you'll be able to go use all of those, the same function signatures against those different ERP systems, and hopefully that will ease your ability to integrate both across those systems and between those systems and other systems. So we have all that technology. All of that technology is currently at some phase of adoption inside of Microsoft. The most significant thing is that we have released the connectors themselves to general availability. And again, the GA target means that they are supported by our product support services group. You can do escalations and do design change requests and those kind of things. So it is an official part of our platform now, and so there's no restrictions on supportability in production environments. The most kind of significant change that you'll see in this versus the old connector is the ability to create an environment variable, which is effectively just a JSON string today, and that string allows you to go through and define the characteristics of the connection to match your specific SAP configuration, right? So I can specify the logon group and type. I can specify the message server host and port. And the message server is what's going to allow me to support connection pooling and session management on the SAP side. So instead of that being done by us, that can be done, that session management is done by SAP. Also being able to specify where your crypto libraries are for secure network connections. And then defining whether or not you're using SNC and whether SSO is configured. Again, if you're using SAP only, then you don't have SSO configuration. But if you're using Kerberos and passing through a token-based identity authentication identity, then you would have to have SSO turned on and have that path encrypted using one of the crypto libraries. So the first kind of step in doing this implementation is going into your dev environment and identifying what your connection string is going to be, and building that out, and then creating an environment variable as part of your solution that you're building that allows you to access your specific instance. We are making some modifications to this to allow things like IT generated connection strings that can't be modified. So I can give someone a connection reference that they can use in a specific environment, but they can't change it, for example. So if I don't want someone in dev modifying the string to go to prod, then I can prevent that from happening, which I can prevent anyway with some other environment configuration stuff. But we just want to make sure that that enterprises, as they open up access to SAP, know that they're the gatekeeper and that you just can't go around them. The second thing we're working on, and you've seen part of it, is the PowerApps content library. So those applications that I showed you are part of a PowerApps content library. Again, we have a release today that contains on the order of 30 or so of those apps. You will see those continue to grow. You'll see the distribution go from, instead of being in a solution file that you have to download from someplace, you'll be able to go into the environment and download an application and have it just pulled directly into your environment. Excuse me. So we are working to make that more accessible, basically, so you can start from a pre-configured template that would include the Power App along with the flows or references to those flows. And again, we're expecting all of that to be out by the end of our fiscal year in June. Excuse me. We're also we will have a Power Automate content library. So think of it as the UI solution and the API solutions as being different, and the API solutions are from the Power Apps content library, right? So if I go in the Power Automate content library, so this is in public preview to the extent that we have some of those flows developed, and they are in that solution as well. So what's going to happen before the end of our fiscal year is that you will see these flows first in the Power Automate experience, just like you can go get a sample flow for SharePoint or email. You'll be able to bring down a sample flow that effectively is like the flow I just showed you, right? So the create SAP sales order flow will be the create sales order flow that's inside of this solution now. So again, this is a packaging issue. It's not a completeness of functionality issue. We're just going to make it easier over time for people to consume that. The other thing we're doing, and I mentioned this before, is that I showed you where I had to scroll down for a while, and if I'm paid by the hour, it's good, but for most of us, that's not good. But the different in the interface itself, so that rather than seeing several hundred fields stream down the designer, you can go pick the field you need, bring it up, and set a value. And so really what you're seeing here is the ability for the IT admin to say, this is the connection you need, and then to put that connection in, and also then specify only the fields you need, as opposed to seeing the 400 fields. So again, these are UI changes, just some minor functionality changes, but any work that you did today with the current stuff would continue to work just when the API changes. And then this is just a mock-up of, I mentioned the ability for IT admins to create a profile, expose that profile, but not make the profile elements editable by the consumer of the connection. And this is just kind of a mock-up of the UI where I have an additional thing called a system. I define that system and all those parameters, and then I share that connection information, that system information, with the user consuming it. So again, API changes, not functionality changes, just making it easier. And then finally, one of the other things that we have put in are, because the way SAP processes data, being primarily an index database, fixed length kind of storage mechanism, there are a lot of legacy artifacts around the way that SAP returns data sets and string arrays, or data with leading zeros that have to be parsed or added, the ability to sort arrays before they get returned to you, those kinds of things. So we've added some functionality so you will only see these things in PowerFX if it's a function that you need, or you would see them in our sample flows where we show that, hey, this is the case. In fact, I showed you the read table action that goes back and reads a table back, but you might see a leading zero function in a case where we are formatting data to send back to SAP, but leading zeros are required. So that PowerFS function does that work rather than you having to write any string manipulation code. So